I'm recording now. So
Perfect.
sorry for that, but we're ready now. So thank you.
Okay, great. So I want to start by just talking for a moment about what is accessibility. And so as to contrast that with the concepts behind universal design. So accessibility is often focused on making something that is not usable by people who have various types of disabilities, either usable or offering them in an alternative. So the picture you see here is an image of a public transportation staircase with a chairlift. And so that is meant to make this accessible to people with disabilities, even though they might need to use a different method of getting up the elevation rise than someone else does. What's notable about something like this, like a chairlift, is both that it separates them from other users in the sense that it's something that can only be used by people with disabilities, and it's also only usable to people with specific types of disabilities. So for example, a chairlift is intended for someone in a wheelchair and generally can't be used by somebody like myself who has a mobility impairment but does not typically use a wheelchair. So then what is universal design? Developed by Ronald L. Mace, a designer and architect, universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So the idea is, rather than accommodating someone's needs by coming up with a separate solution, you instead try to create an initial solution that is available to everyone equally. So I usually think of the hierarchy being an accommodation is where you might offer something different that's meant to make up for the fact that someone with a disability can't do something. Accessibility is when you may offer a separate solution that is for people with certain types of disabilities. And universal design is perhaps highest goal in that it's just there for everyone who might need it for any particular reason. So who benefits from this? Well, a big part of it is making something that's inclusive for people with disabilities. About 15% of the population worldwide has a disability, and more than 10% of post-secondary students do. But this is also beneficial to other groups. Older adults people often think of who might have things like declining vision. Often the same things that you might do to help people with disabilities are also helpful for non-native English speakers. And they're also going to often be helpful to people who are distracted, anxious, or overwhelmed, even if they may not have a disability or any other ongoing need. They may have a situational need that arises because of the situation that they find themselves in. So really, universal design is meant to benefit everyone, and that's one of the benefits of taking this approach. So what's a concrete, so universal design, I should also say, is meant to assume that the range of human ability is ordinary and not special. And this is a great quote from Elaine Ostroff, and I like to include it because I think it also speaks to the fact that universal design really does a lot to be inclusive. So rather than separating somebody out and saying you need special help, whether that's because of your disability, whether it's because you're struggling with a topic, for whatever reason, instead it's merely saying, no, everyone has a range of abilities, and that's what we're going to plan on from the start. So what's an example of universal design that you may be familiar with? Probably the most prevalent one that everyone has seen is curb cuts. So if you've really been out anywhere on the street, you've likely seen these. And they were originally designed mostly for people with wheelchairs. They allow you to navigate a curb even if you can't go down a step. But who hasn't seen someone with a stroller, on a skateboard, on a bicycle, pushing a book truck? There are all sorts of reasons why you might use this rather than step off the curb. And so it's something where really it's a design feature that's used by everyone and appreciated by everyone rather than merely being something that's for people with disabilities. So then what is universal design for learning? Professor David Rose and others have taken this framework of universal design and tried to say, well, what would this mean in a learning format? And they've created a framework for designing educational environments and products and tools that are accessible and optimal for all learners. And it's again meant to create this inclusive learning environment where you're responsive to a lot of different types of needs that people who are participating in whatever learning situation you are facilitating may have. So the Universal Design for Learning guidelines say that you should provide multiple means of engagement, which basically helps you to have purposeful, motivated learners by helping to stimulate their interest and personal motivation for learning by offering lots of different ways of engaging. You should have multiple means of representation so that you're presenting information and content in different ways so that you're creating resourceful, knowledgeable learners who not only understand all the different ways that the material can be presented, but also if they have struggle with one means of representation, they can understand a different means of representation. And you should provide multiple means of action and expression. And this means that you differentiate the ways that students can express what they know so that you can allow them to not only achieve their own personalized goals, but also you can help them to be more strategic in their learning. So I would take a moment to say that I think all of these are particularly important for the types of teaching that the Carpentries does for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it's important because you're working with learners who are inherently trying to learn something mostly for their own self-motivation. It's not something where it's a required core class for an undergraduate who's merely going to have to take it. You're looking at more people who are there because they have their own goals, they have their own needs, and they're really trying to achieve these. And so allowing for them to make their own modifications, make their own customizations, and building that into what you're teaching is something that really will help them to learn better, but it'll also help them to achieve the goals that they came into your classes with. And the other thing is that I think that Universal Design for Learning is very important when you're teaching skills of the types that the Carpentries are teaching, where there might be learners who have disabilities, but there might also be learners who merely feel intimidated and therefore are dealing with a type of anxiety that might put stresses on their learning that they're not used to encountering and might help them, make them react to what you're teaching in a different manner, even if they're not fully realizing it. So a lot of what Universal Design for Learning teaches is something that I think will help you to better achieve the goals that everyone, that you're trying to achieve through this, and that everyone is coming together to try to learn when people are voluntarily joining your learning sessions. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of the areas. So for multiple means of engagement, what we mean by that is a few different things. First, you should offer multiple ways to recruit interest. And when we say recruit interest, we mean, why do people want to do the lesson? Yes, they've decided that they want to come to a carpentry session already, but what gets them excited for the individual thing that they are being asked to do, the exercise that they're being asked to do? And what you want to do there is you want to ideally allow for choice. So are there ways that you can say, here are 3 different options and you can pick the one that's most relevant to your goals for the class? Are there ways that if you're working with data, for example, you can have them bring in their own data sets to work with? Are there ways that maybe you can have teams, as I know many of your lessons do, and different members of the teams do different functions, and that allows them to also sort of self-select what piece of it they're most interested in. But you also, when you can't offer choice, or even when you can, you want to authentically explain the relevance and the value. So rather than simply saying, complete task A, you want to say to them, complete task A because this is the first stage towards learning how to do this, which you can apply in these scenarios. Or else, here's the value that you can get out of learning how to complete this exercise. Here's how we're going to build on this exercise later in the day. That can help to bring about a different level and type of engagement with the materials that you're sharing. And then you want to think about the environment that you're creating for people to learn in. And I think this is something that you've already done in a lot of ways by how you integrate different means with the sticky notes of indicating whether or not people are following along or falling behind. But you want to really try to create a distraction-free, non-threatening space where everyone feels comfortable, where no one feels like they're falling behind, where people recognize that everyone is bringing different things to the table. And that really is going to help to give people the capacity, I would say, to be fully engaged with what you're teaching them. And this is really all about pathways. You want people to see the pathway that they want, that's meaningful for them forward, as something that they can get out of the lesson from day one. You don't want to wait for that step until the end of the day. You want to be building that in all along to make sure that they're seeing what they're getting out of it, and they're seeing how engaging with this material fully is going to benefit them right from the start. Next, you want to think about supporting sustained effort and persistence, because we know this can be difficult, especially if you get frustrated. It can be very hard to persist through that. It can be very difficult to not give up, even whether fully give up or just sort of mentally just feel like you're not really getting it. So you want to keep goals and objectives front and center, and you want to make them something that people can feel like they're getting closer and closer to. So you want to offer them small steps along the way. You should have not necessarily a single huge goal at the end of the day, but instead you want to have small goals and objectives that they can work their way towards. You want to offer varying demands and challenges. So you might offer 2 different levels in an exercise, where this is the exercise that you should be doing if you're feeling like you're not quite confident, or if you want a more basic, easy solution. And here's something that if you really want to challenge yourself, you can do, because a lot of times having that ability to choose and also being able to fall back for one of the exercises to something that feels a little easier can give people a real sense of accomplishment. They can think, okay, well, even though maybe I didn't do the higher level option, I really did manage to achieve this lower level option. Something that I think that Carpentries lessons already do a good job of, but you can always do more with, is integrating collaboration with peers, because that feedback can really help people to keep going and help people to feel like they're working towards a goal collectively with others. And a real mantra, I think, should be focus on mastery, not performance. So your feedback should be about, how am I going to encourage you to continue to build your skills, not how am I going to correct what you've done wrong with this exercise. So you don't want to be thinking about it as like a teacher taking out their red pen and marking all the problems. You want to focus on thinking about how you can get people to that mastery state. How can you take people and provide feedback that's going to feel like it's helping them to build, rather than it's breaking down what they've done wrong in the past. And this is really going to be something where having people work together in groups can be really important for that. And that's because they can each be doing whatever they feel the most confident with, which is how it can help with the sort of offering different levels of challenge. If there's group work, often one person might be able to do something that doesn't feel as challenging for them, even though it's still building to the same exercise. And also through the collaborative process, people generally feel more confident and comfortable because they see that the other people are often also having questions. They might be different questions, they might be different struggles, but they see that, that everyone's different and that there's not just the sense that they are a failure within it. Another aspect of this is you want to encourage self-regulation. So allow for personalized goals and motivation. And a piece of this for something like the Carpentries might be incorporating either as a pre-session, maybe something that they write down, or something that you go around the room when you introduce yourself at the beginning, saying what you hope to get out of what you're learning. Because setting that goal and really having to articulate it can help you to keep up your motivation and to keep you engaged as you're going through the lessons. And scaffold personal coping strategies. So rather than telling someone, here's what you should have done here, have them think about, well, if you were out in the real world and you ran into this problem, how might you troubleshoot it? What are tools that you would use? Would you ask a colleague? Would you search for the answer online? Would you refer back to the earlier lessons from today? And help people to figure out how they would cope, because that's something that can build confidence. If you just give someone the answer, or even if you help someone to figure out the answer, but without telling them how they could do it by themselves, it can be really difficult to not feel as though you're going to maybe learn it during the day, but not be able to apply it in the future. And encourage the development of self-assessment and reflection. That can be helped by having them set goals at the beginning and motivation at the beginning, and then encouraging reflection at the end about how they think they're doing about achieving those goals and what their next steps might be. And that can also help them to stay engaged with the process after the class as well. So merely finishing Carpentries is great, but what is their next goal? Now that they've achieved that goal, what do they want to do with that? How do they want to stay part of the community? Maybe that could be a piece of it, is reflecting on what their goal for continuing to interact with the larger Carpentries community is, or how can they, what would their next project be that would help them to take what they've learned and expand upon it a bit. And this really supports student growth so that you're not creating a scenario where they can only work in a classroom situation, or where they feel like, okay, well, I managed to push through on this day, but I still didn't truly understand it, or I was still the weakest person in the room secretly, or any of those sorts of doubts that are going to help them to break off of later engagement once they're outside of the classroom environment. Now, next up is multiple means of representation. And some of these are pretty obvious. These are where you get into the things that people maybe think about more when they think of accessibility, very obviously. And you want to provide alternatives for perception. So you want to provide audio options, maybe a video, or in your case, a live demo option. Offer a way for people to customize what representations they're using for online materials, and think about how you're providing alternatives for people who may have perception preferences or even perception problems. So people with visual disabilities, people who are hard of hearing or deaf, how are they going to be able to interact with the materials that you're providing? This is really important because a lot of times people will think about it in terms of accessibility, but it can also be in terms of just the amount of stress and comfort that you're able to foster with people. Some people would rather read something, some people would rather listen to it. And that is maybe not necessarily something that's going to prevent them from doing it, but when you're trying to create a welcoming, inclusive, and low stress environment, it can really help to provide multiple options so that everyone feels like they're all on an equal playing field. Next up is providing alternatives for language, symbols, and mathematical expressions. And this is one that I think is very important to think about for teaching topics like those that are taught by the Carpentries. You know, you want to be, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of symbols that people maybe don't normally work with. There are some mathematical expressions, and you want to be clarifying all the time terms, structure, syntax. How can you strip it down so that it's as clear as possible? And this is why it was exciting to see that at least some of your lessons have a whole section on understanding jargon to start off with. Where possible, you want to offer the option for people to be able to translate language to whatever their native language is, interpret symbols so that they can understand what their actual meaning is, what they represent. And oftentimes what can help with this is illustrating things with multimedia. And I think that the important thing to keep in mind is, I took this directly from one of the Carpentries lessons, and for a lot of people who are used to working with code, this makes complete sense. But to someone who isn't used to it and is in fact fairly stressed at the idea, or off-put, or feels intimidated by the idea of symbols, or maybe thinks of themselves as somebody who's not good at math, even though this doesn't involve any math, it involves symbols that they probably haven't used this math class. And it's just keeping in mind, how can you translate this to be plainer meaning so that it's understandable to someone, and it's not going to have that immediate sort of heart leaping reaction when you just suddenly look at something that looks completely foreign to you. Next up, you want to provide support for comprehension. So you want to make sure that people are fully understanding what you're saying. And part of that is offering background information. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you go into in great depth in the class. It can be links to additional information for those who are struggling, that they can go to during the breaks, or that they know is there that they can refer to after they leave, and providing options for resources that provide more background information. I think one thing that a lot of your lessons do a really good job of is emphasizing key ideas and patterns. You often have that at the end where you sort of say, what were the key things here? And another piece of that, I think, can be incorporating for each lesson more concrete outlined learning objectives at the top, so that people know what they're trying to get out of what they're seeing in front of them. And that can sort of help with the engagement piece, but it can also help with, when they're referring back to it, remembering what they learned. Guide the information processing that is going on in the room by helping people to fully understand what they're learning, not just try to answer the problem, but understanding how it's going to apply to something else, process the information in a way that's going to be meaningful for them in an ongoing basis. And explain how to transfer that knowledge to other areas and generalize it, which I think particularly for these types of lessons can often be really tricky. It's like, great, I learned how to do this exact exercise that you gave me, and I feel really confident at it. And now, and when I go out in the world and I'm presented with a new data set and somebody asks me to accomplish this goal, I have absolutely no idea where to start because I have no idea how I would do the same thing outside of an exercise format. That's where I think that you can spend time talking about how you transfer the knowledge, what the other resources someone might refer to find out more about this are. All that type of information can be really helpful. And this is also where you should be thinking about how can you support different types of and more meaningful types of processing. Can you encourage people to visualize what they're learning? Can you encourage people to use color coding or other things that are going to make it meaningful to them, and make that something that's integrated into and recommended as part of the class can really help to make it feel more inclusive for people. Then you have multiple means of action and expression. And this involves things like incorporating physical activities. For information, this could mean varying navigation either by actually moving around a space or by just varying how you navigate through the information. And this is also when you want to think about how you're going to support the use of tools for anything physical that is involved. And that can even be something physical like using a computer. We don't necessarily think of that as a physical task, but for someone with mobility impairments, it is. So think about whether there's any software or any tools in your lessons that are going to be problematic for people who need to use assistive devices, for example. And this is where you want to think about, like, do things work with tools like JAWS and Kurzweil, which are two text-to-speech tools that people might use in different scenarios, and consider what tools you're recommending to people and whether or not they're going to be usable with the tech that they need to use. And you want to offer alternative means of communication. So when people are asked to give responses, where possible, Universal Design for Learning recommends allowing the use of multimedia for expression. So rather than saying that someone has to provide their answer in the form of an essay, you might also allow a drawing, a video, an audio, any of those sorts of things. Use tools to support the construction of responses. So make sure that you're offering options. If there is something that someone has to turn in, for example, an exercise or something written, are you providing a way to do it electronically as well as a way to do it on paper for someone who isn't able necessarily to hold a pen and paper? And offer lots of options to practice and perform. And this is another area where I think that Carpentries does a good job, because you offer these interactive lessons and this ability to do a lot of different types of practice of the skills that you're teaching. And really you want to be thinking about not just parking someone in front of a computer, but how can you integrate many different ways of learning, many different ways of interacting, many different ways of conveying back what you have learned. And you want to support the development of executive functions. So this goes back to what we were saying about guiding personal goal setting, help people to learn about how they can plan things and strategize the steps that would get them to their goals, support how they manage the information that they're learning that day, how are they going to keep track of their notes, how are they going to organize their materials, and support their own internal and external progress monitoring, help to advise them how they might track what they're learning, how they might monitor whether they're achieving their own goals, and really keep track of that so that they know that they are or are not achieving their goals. And one of the things that I think that you do with that that's interesting is, as I alluded to before, the idea of using sticky notes at your lessons to signal that you're doing well or that you're not doing well. But one thing I would sort of encourage you to think about, if you haven't already, is providing other opportunities for that. So for example, if someone doesn't feel comfortable, particularly if they're with a lot of their coworkers, some people may not feel comfortable saying that they're falling behind. So are there ways that you can offer an anonymous online tool that allows people to sort of check into groups to see whether or not most of the people in the group fall in the green or the red? And that can help to alleviate the stress or social anxiety piece of it for those who might feel that there is a lot of social anxiety, either because of the people they're with or because they don't like large groups, in admitting that they're not doing well or that they feel like they're struggling. And simple little things like that can really help people to engage in it in a different way and alleviate some of the stress that could otherwise be felt. So then I wanted to take a moment and this is one of the library carpentry lessons from Introduction to Data. I just took a screenshot of it, which I hope you all are okay with. And I wanted to take a moment to have you look at this, and most of you may be familiar with it, and think a little bit about what some of the good things for universal design purposes that are done here are, so that you can see in action some of what I'm talking about. So as an example, I'm going to, let me see if I can leave this up on the screen and still be seeing my list on my other screen so that I can let you all sort of be looking at this at the same time. So one thing that I think is great about having jargon busting as a topic that I mentioned before is that goes back to what we were talking about explaining complex terminology. That's really important in helping people to learn the topic and making sure that you're keeping people engaged and not losing people along the way or discouraging people. You're also offering options for people to focus in on areas of personal interest. So rather than telling people to define these 3 terms, this lesson does a nice job of saying you should terms you've come across that you wish you better knew. And that's not necessarily even ones that you don't understand at all or that are the hardest, but you sort of phrase it as, what do you feel you should know better, which I think is a great way of recruiting interest and a great way of making sure that people are involved. This is really supporting the collaboration piece. You're offering people a choice of roles here. They have the option to decide if they're going to take notes or not. And then within the group, people can select who's going to report back. And that's the sort of thing where you're allowing people to take different roles. You're scaffolding coping techniques by introducing how they might look for the answers to these questions. And at the end, you highlight the key points to allow them something that they can go back to make sure that they are keeping track of what was it that was most important to learn out of this lesson. Why did I do this? And so I think that that's where you can see that already a lot of the library carpentry lessons build in a lot of these things. But the challenge, I think, is to think about how you can think about it even more systematically and make sure that all of the lessons are integrating these topics and consider what more might be done to improve even the ones that already do have some of the universal design elements integrated into them. So then I just want to leave it open for questions. I don't know if anybody had any questions about anything I've talked about or other topics about accessibility and universal design for learning with the Carpentries lessons. But I wanted to try to allow plenty of time for any questions people might have.
Yeah, and there's also on the Etherpad, if you can't see it, there's a place for questions and comments, but you can also write them in the chat window as well. So if you want to ask your question there, but I'll pause just a little. I have some questions, but I'll pause for someone else to maybe ask. And Carrie might have a question. I muted her. She's on her phone, so I'll unmute her if she has a question.
No question. Thank you.
Okay, I was just checking. Well, okay, I can start, Carly. So there was one thing that you pointed out, which I thought was really, really good, and actually what's coming up more as we look at updating our lessons, and that's our exercises. And so you pointed out an exercise which doesn't have that much description and context around it, or just you showed the a shell lesson example, and it has some HTML code. It has a line that you can, something you can put on the command line to work with that HTML, but it's lacking a lot of description around it and additional context. And so that was something that I think really was helpful. And so there's that middle ground that you have to reach between like being too verbose and then being more succinct. And so I'm wondering if you have some examples of like exercises that you've seen that that like sort of speak to that, the cases you've seen that answer that.
I don't know if I can point to any that are online right now, though I can look after the call, but I took a Python class once many, many years ago, and that's why I'm not sure if it would be online anymore, where the way that they handled that, which I thought was really nice, was that they had maybe the same amount that you have right now, except then if you wanted more explanation, you could click through to additional pages so that it was there as a support for you if you wanted it, or if you wanted to refer back to it later on, but it wasn't something that was expected that every single person was going to be reading through. And so you were presenting people with the same amount of information maybe that you have right now, but then having certain areas, say, if you have questions on this, or if you would like more details, click here. And that way, there is that option for people to say, yeah, I think I need a little bit more information at only certain steps. So maybe step 1 is easy for some people and step 4 is not, vice versa. And that's something that this way people can just select what they want to do.
Yeah, that's great. I don't think we have too many of these. We have sections where we have links to resources, but not exactly on, in line with the exercises sometimes. So that's a really great piece of advice. Thanks. So let me, someone has a hand. So Mark, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so a follow-up to that, you were talking about at the end of my workshops, we put in a list both in the Etherpad and gets emailed to the learners this idea of click through for links for more information. So it's not necessarily with the curriculum, and it tends to be a little bit more local in flavor. So in terms of what I do for my institution. So is this something that we, add to the curriculum as maybe possible links to say these have been used at other workshops so that they can make a choice to get to those extra links? Or, because I see what you're saying, it's the follow-up and it's, for more information. And so I give them all at the very end and I put it at the very front of the Etherpad, and then they get emailed that same list.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you can integrate that, at least any of those materials that you think might help people who are struggling during the day, right in with the lesson, that allows them to sort of select when they need additional help a little bit more seamlessly. I also think it can be helpful because it gives it a context even after the fact. If they're looking back at the lesson, then they know, oh, this is the resource that goes with this exercise or these types of topics, which can make it a little bit easier when they're then trying to apply it somewhere else, I think.
So the other issue then is that Carpentries generally does not have the learners with the lesson open. The idea is to code along or work along with the instructor. And so my fear is that if we give them those links in the midst of the instruction, they start clicking down the links, and now their attention is split. And it gives them the potential to potentially fall further behind because they start to go down this rabbit hole of trying to solve an immediate problem that, I just...
In a face-to-face situation, where you're actually, or in a situation where it's synchronous, I think another alternative certainly would be to just have them on hand to show to somebody who says, I'm struggling with X, Y, or Z and would like to look at a little bit more about it. It could be something where they have to sort of ask you for it, so it's not just there as a distraction, but instead only when they actually need it. That might be an alternative, because I do think sometimes people otherwise are tempted to just sort of be half listening and half looking at the list of additional information.
Another, just the suggestions, we in our exercises, so Mark's right, we don't necessarily teach off the lessons. I have seen instructors do that before, but we also have this drop down that you can click on, so you don't have the answers right away under an exercise. You have to click on this button to reveal them, and so that's where maybe the link, the link can be included there, so it's not exactly there, in the description, but it could be also included there. But
well, you could also build it out. I mean, this would be more work, but you could also set it up so that basically, rather than just the options being no answer or answer, it could be no answer, hint, answer. So people could say, rather than that they want to see the full answer, they just want to see what are the support materials, or what's the sort of hint along the way, what would you point me to for more information? And then if that still doesn't help them, then they can see the answer. And that also gives them a little bit more of this ability to feel like they're not giving up and just looking at the answer, but seeing an intermediate step.
Yeah, very interesting. So does anyone else have a follow-up question? Okay. I have another question.
Okay.
And so it's actually more or less a comment that may turn into a question, but it's great that you picked out jargon busting. It is a great lesson. But I also feel like we rush through it, and so one of the things I've heard is afterwards there are a lot of terms listed that people wanted to hear definition of, and you're only able to walk through some of the terms sometimes and give a little bit more background to it. But then I hear people say, I wasn't able to, to learn everything through that exercise. And so that's been something I've heard. The other thing, looking at the jargon busting lesson, the screenshot, I realized I'm a more visual person. And so on that page, there's no images really to maybe walk you through how a jargon busting session goes, right? It's all text. And I mean, as you were speaking, I just realized I'm very visual. And when we're describing it in our session, I have actually heard that as well from people that seem to be very visual too. Like, how is this going to go? And so this is just an observation of something else, like you said, different modes of how people are learning these things with the jargon busting.
Well, I think to your first point about not being able to cover all the topics, that can actually almost be a good thing, as long as the way you're teaching it, you're focusing on how they would answer that question for themselves outside of the lesson area. So what are recommended resources? Who would they ask? Like, maybe the answer is that they should ask members of the Carpentries community outside of it. And that's something that you would explicitly say as part of the lesson. And the reason for that, the reason I think that could be a good thing is because even if you walk through every topic, that any word that anyone could have a question on that day, they're going to encounter new terminology, new topics are going to emerge in these areas because They always do. And they need to have the ability to go beyond just, I know what they taught me, and move on to, I know how to apply what they taught me to build on my own skills going forward and to continue to expand. So I think in some ways, you don't necessarily need to cover every single topic as long as you're covering how they might get the answers to that later. And I do think that putting more pictures or of that type of thing, so even if you can take pictures at actual sessions maybe and integrate them into some of the lessons, could make it a little bit more clear for people how some of the elements that are unique to Carpentries or how some of the activities are going to work and might be a nice addition to the lessons themselves.
Yeah, that might be, and it also makes your lesson a little bit more accessible, like, because people have hard time sometimes visualizing what a workshop looks like, so that could be good. But Mark also mentioned something that happens. It's not something, I think, it's something that helpers know. They're in the background helping with sticky notes and working troubleshooting, but they're also sometimes adding links and other things into the Etherpad based on people's questions. So that happens in the Etherpad where people, where helpers actually help with like answering anything else. So that's another way that we support learners. But that was a good point, Mark. Is anyone else? So if I hope Anna or Nina or if you have any questions, I hope we're answering them. But please raise your hand if you have a question at the moment.
I also included my email address and how you can contact me on Twitter. If people have questions later, they're welcome to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to answer more questions. So for Carpentries, or if you have questions for outside of Carpentries too, I'm always happy to try to answer accessibility and universal design questions for people.
Okay, so there are more hands now. There are more questions. So Nina has a hand, and then Mark has a hand. So Nina, if you want to ask a question.
I was just mulling over the idea of adding more diagrams or pictures, but then I feel like that takes me down a mental rabbit hole where I think about, okay, what would be a picture that would illustrate that? But then I feel like, well, but then the picture needs some sort of a caption or a description of how it may differ conceptually from the text. And I just sort of start mentally looping about whether pictures are adding for some people, but then for other people, I'm always worried that an image may not be readable or accessible to them. Am I just thinking too hard about it? Or is this a common problem people run into?
Well, I think that if the picture is really intended to reproduce what the text is saying, so if you're purely illustrating what the text is saying, you can either do simple alt text that indicates that fact, or you can mark it as decorative, which means you leave the alt text blank, because it's really not conveying new information. It's just a different representation of the same information that you're already conveying. So basically, in that sense, the text that you have there is already the description of the image. But if it is really a completely separate image, then yeah, you would also want to make sure, obviously, that you have something that makes that accessible. So it can get into a little bit more of a complicated situation, adding images, but hopefully most of the images you would be adding would sort of just be adding on to and explaining or replicating what the text is in a different format, if it was truly to make it more universally designed.
Thanks.
Mark.
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Nina.
So, Carli, I'm also, I teach a lot of the data and software carpentries. And so did you, when you look at our lessons, actually have a chance to look at things like the extras that we have listed at the top of our curriculums?
I didn't look at I only looked at a couple of lessons. I haven't looked at all of them, no.
Yeah, so I'm just going to point out to maybe people who aren't nearly as familiar, we have like reference sections and discussion sections where feedback from how people maybe taught stuff or could work for alternate explanations. And then there's an extra section on all the figures that got used that are separate for them so they can incorporate them into slides and not necessarily have to show the curriculum and whatnot, which I think that might be another avenue as we in the library start to go through our curriculums to think that not everything, like you said, has to be answered in the actual presentation, but if the learner has an opportunity to find that stuff easily and associate it with the lesson and all. So I'm just pointing that out for you. And then I'm just going to show off, we just got our new set of stickies. And one is the stars because green and red are colorblind issues. And we have a colorblind librarian. So we're doing stars for green stickies. So the idea is that, hey, I've done it and whatever, and we're still keeping the traditional red for when they're having problems. So we're trying to incorporate more of those types of things as well, thinking about what our learners are potentially coming with that may not necessarily talk about or give us a heads up about.
Definitely, yeah.
And that it's interesting. So the Post-it note is like this universal thing that you don't feel as much anxiety when you go to another place to teach that someone's going to have Post-it notes available, if you forget them, because they are very important to the learning. But it just seems like now I'm seeing, more of the lessons starting to think about moving away from the computer and applying what you mentioned, which is different modes of learning. And, sometimes working with paper. And so that, one of the lessons that is in development right now is called Digital Preservation Library Carpentry, I think it's the name. But they have a section on workflows, and it involves these cards that you have to move around to look at how your workflow might be different than others, what makes sense to you, which is a little bit different than what we've done before, which is more tool-based. And so there's that other side of material, having the material on hand. But, I guess they can account for just having a pencil or pen and paper, as an alternative. But I just, wondered, have you seen that too, Carli, with like, but you mentioned Python or, some other tool-based training that you've seen people break out and use, not use the computer.
Somewhat. I mean, I think that sounds like a cool lesson you're describing. I haven't seen one that goes to that degree of sort of moving the cards around, but I think that sort of thing is a great option, especially when integrated with other parts of the lesson that have different types of learning, because it does give people more options to feel like, even if they aren't equally excited about all the different sections, maybe they feel like they better understand things by physically moving them through space. That's really helpful for a lot of people. So I think it's great to integrate it, though I haven't seen many of these types of technology trainings doing so yet.
We've got a question about what sticky note vendor are you using, Mark?
This is from Staples.
Ah.
and I wish they had more than just stars. They got like word clouds and they got some like items. I was hoping for some like triangles and maybe a pentagon or something as well. The other problem is that we use the Post-its to have people write stuff on, and the stars are a little bit smaller than the standard 3x3.
They look great. So we're almost up here, but Carli, I had one more question for you, which is you mentioned having these sort of personal goals of what you are expecting to get out of a lesson, and what if you don't know initially, and because I really like that, because it speaks to sometimes the challenge that we have of context in the library carpentry lessons, which is like, I think you mentioned, how can I take this and use this in my work when I get back?
Mm-hmm.
Developing their own goals and answering those questions as sort of like their own separate, because we use this common Etherpad, and this ability to have something on the side, or even ask those questions, like you said, without having some of these social stigmas. But those are sort of two questions there, wrapped up into one. But I wonder, if you have any advice on that front. Like, one of the things that we do is we do something at the end, which is of a day, which is called one up, one down, and you go across the room and from one person to the next, saying, what did you think was challenging? What did you think was good? And it would be interesting to think about that initially too. Doing that as far as goal setting.
Yeah, I think there's I'm cognizant of the fact that you have a finite amount of time to work with folks, so there are maybe things that you can't add, but one way that I think you could add the goal piece is to either have an activity at the beginning where people come together in small groups, ideally maybe with a helper at each one, to help them make sure they understand what the goals they could have are, and talk about goals that they have. And that way, if some people maybe don't have fully developed goals, they can sort of develop them through the conversation with other people in their group, hopefully. And the other opportunity, particularly if you need to save time, I think, is to ask people to set some goals before the lesson and sort of submit them to you. And maybe having them think about that even before they come and having the people who are the instructors have a chance to see what people's goals are, might help to really inform, not changing the whole lesson, but just the way things are presented, and who maybe you put in groups. All those sorts of things can really be helped by understanding a little bit more about what individual goals are at the beginning. And I think it might be interesting, another alternative for something you might do at the beginning is that for many people who are coming into these types of classes in a very new thing, some of the things might be very intimidating. So at the beginning, sort of to mirror what you do at the end, to sort of one up and one down, you might say something about what is one thing you're looking forward to, what's one thing that intimidates you, and that would be something you did in the morning at the beginning. And then at the end, when you're doing the wrap up and you're talking about what was one thing that was good, what was one thing that was challenging, people could also be reflecting just personally how that changed. Like, was the thing that they were intimidated by the thing that they found challenging, or was that actually easy and it was something else? And that self-reflection piece can be really useful, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, we have surveys that we send out, but they don't necessarily, I think, speak to those goals. Maybe they come in. You see them in the surveys sometimes. Like, I'm hoping to do this, but not all the time. But we do get that initially through a survey sometimes. If we're able to see it before a workshop. But that's how we've done our assessment as well. Is sort of gauging where people are at initially, and then sending a survey to them afterwards. But it's hard to get the survey filled out after. But
right.
Yeah. Sorry. Who was that? You, Carly?
Yeah, I was just saying, yeah, definitely it's hard to get people to fill out a survey in really any context of it, but particularly after something. But yeah, I think anything you can do to prompt that reflection before and after can be helpful for people. Yeah.
So we're we're about 2 minutes to the end here, and I just wanted to thank you, Carli, again.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it's been really helpful. And I'll be sharing. Usually, I share the slides and the notes through different channels, but since we're recording this, I think I'll be posting this on the Carpentries YouTube channel now too, and I think hopefully we'll get a lot of other people will see this, and I definitely will encourage people to watch it because I think I learned a lot. So and I hope everyone else did on the call. It sounds like they did, but it's super helpful.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope everyone found it useful. And do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions after the fact as well.
Okay, definitely. Is it fine if I share your email then as well?
Yeah, that's
okay.
fine.
All right. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll share that. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, then they can reach out to you. Thanks again, Carli.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Carli.
Bye.
Bye.